Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Churchill said of Russia that it was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Much the same might be said of trying to untangle the relationship between Trump and his associates on the one hand and Putin and a high-power cast of Russian oligarchs and mobsters on the other. There comes a time in every political scandal when it reaches a tipping point. For Iran-Contra, it was perhaps the revelation of the weapons sales. For Watergate, perhaps the testimony of Alexander Butterfield about the existence of the White House tapes. For Trump and Russia, it may very well be the revelations from a bombshell story just out from WhoWhatWhy.org. The story gives us a whole new view of the Trump-Russia connection, one that stretches from Trump Tower to the FBI to the Kremlin. Here to reveal and explain all of this on Radio Who, What, Why, I'm joined by Russ Baker, the founder and editor-in-chief of Who, What, Why, and Jonathan Larson, a former editor of the Village Voice and now a senior editor and board member of Who, What, Why. Russ Baker, Jonathan Larson, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Russ, I want to start with you because at the core of this story is this long-running FBI investigation that was taking place that really involved things above and beyond politics. It really involved an international organized crime network. Talk a little about that first.
I think the takeaway here is that Donald Trump was essentially partnered in business with a man who was connected to Russian organized crime and indirectly to Vladimir Putin. And the FBI knew about that and didn't want any of that to come out. So we don't see how the FBI can properly investigate Trump's relationship to Russia.
Talk a little bit about what that investigation was all about, Russ.
This goes back to the 1990s when the FBI was becoming increasingly concerned about the organized crime from the former Soviet Union. I called it Russian organized crime. It's basically from all of the various republics of the former Soviet Union, but that they were getting a foothold in the United States. They were getting into everything, and they were particularly concerned that they were getting into Wall Street. Or getting into the financial system. And as they saw more and more examples of this, they were looking to do something about it, and they discovered a particular scheme which was targeting vulnerable people, particularly elderly and unsophisticated investors, and they managed to shut it down. But in the course of shutting it down, they cut a deal with one of the defendants, and he became a very important informant. And this man, Felix Sater, is essentially the core of our story along with Trump himself.
And Jonathan, Russ talked about the fact that this started back in the 90s. Talk a little bit about the even earlier aspect of Trump Tower, and the Trump Tower as a place was something that the FBI was looking at back as early as 1983.
Right. Yes, there were a lot of mobsters that seemed to be in and out of Trump Tower from its earliest days, including associates of the Union Concrete boss who was mobbed up, who actually built Trump Tower, and he helped his girlfriend get the 2 floors worth of apartments underneath Trump's triplex. And actually, she not only bought those apartments, but she ended up getting mob money to help finance them, and Trump also arranged for a mortgage for her, and the bank that did that didn't ask her for any paperwork. She didn't have to sign anything, which is kind of unusual. There were a lot of strange characters from very early on, including some that had some ties to Russia.
It was remarkable how many of these strange characters populated Trump Tower. It was almost like, if you put it on its side as an oil field, anywhere you would drill, you'd run into somebody with a Russian connection. Talk about why that might have been.
Well, in the early days, there were a couple of Russian connections, but there was a lot more sort of Italian organized crime. It's hard to say how that could be. They seem to get the choicest floors. They would buy multiple apartments, and this lady friend of the concrete boss actually demanded that she be able to put in a swimming pool, which actually meant they had to redesign the building and put in even more concrete. That's good for the concrete business. Why this was so, it's very hard to say. But there certainly seem to be too many of them to be just a coincidence.
Yeah, one of the things I might add about that is that in terms of mobsters in general, certainly, if you talk about the bling factor, I think they like the glitz and glamour associated with the Trump name and the building itself. And as far as the people from the former Soviet Union, whom we describe in some detail in the article, and we only cover some of them who moved into the building, and not suggesting that anybody, by the way, who's from those areas is necessarily involved with any sort of wrongdoing at all. But the fact of the matter is that when the Soviet Union came apart, all of these newly minted millionaires and billionaires, questionable, perhaps we could say ill-gotten fortunes, and they had to get the money out of there. And as you probably know, Jeff, real estate is a favored method of money laundering.
Talk a little bit, Russ, about why this investigation was so important to the FBI, this investigation into the Russian mob.
The Russian mob had practices that you did not see with La Cosa Nostra, and particularly at the end of the Soviet Union, it recruited many highly skilled people, computer scientists, mathematicians, financial whizzes, and they went right for where the money was, which is the financial system and the Wall Street and what have you, and banking. And so they got it in a big way. And I think the FBI was late to realize what was going on. And then there was this panic that the whole financial system of the United States and perhaps the world could be destabilized. And so as they began scrambling and identifying this issue as perhaps their number one problem, they focused on a man who was called the boss of bosses of this former Soviet Union organized crime, a fellow named Mogilevich, and they began trying to figure out how to gather information on him. And what we know is that this man that they turned, this Felix Sater, was involved with Russian organized crime, that the financial wrongdoing that he was involved with was not just him, but was being orchestrated from some other level. Also, his father allegedly was an associate of Mogilevich. And so this particular man, for whatever reason, and we don't know the details, was considered to be an extremely, and I want to emphasize extremely, high-value asset, tremendously important figure in a tremendously important operation.
Jonathan, talk a little bit more about Mogilevich and why he was so important and why he was considered such a real threat.
Well, because he had a global reach. I mean, he was beginning to send emissaries to the United States to set up kind of money laundering operations, stock fraud operations, and the feds were beginning to believe that just one phone call from him could practically bring down the financial system. And Felix Sater was part of one of these original groups, as Russ explained. And in the indictment that the FBI brought against him, they figure he was responsible for at least $40 million of fraud against his victims. So the fact that they would turn him and make him a cooperating informant was kind of astonishing, because they certainly could have put him away in jail, and they kept working with him, and he ends up in Trump Tower and doing business with Trump. And why was that? That's the great mystery at the heart of this. Were they hoping through Trump to find out more about the Russian mob? Was it even conceivable that they were working with Trump directly? These are all things that will need to come out eventually. But that's part of the mystery of this FBI operation at the heart of Trump Tower.
And Russ, talk about how the FBI originally came to Sater.
Well, they came to him because of this so-called pump and dump stock scheme that he was involved with. And this was, as I mentioned, this thing where they victimized elderly and unsophisticated investors. And this was the kind of thing that there was pressure on the Bureau to shut them down, and they did. And one of the perps in there was this Felix Sater. And I guess for whatever reason, once they either talked to him or investigated him, they found out what sort of connections he had, and they became very, very interested. They became interested in Felix Sater prior to Felix Sater, as John said, moved into Trump Tower with this company called Bayrock, which was a real estate development firm, and Bayrock and Donald Trump became partners in a number of ventures around the world, most notably the Trump Soho Hotel and condominiums that's here in New York. And so he became very, very important, so important, in fact, that according to Sater himself, he and Trump were extremely close, and he had an office just on the floor below Trump's, and that he would just walk up the stairs and just pop in to hang out with the Donald. And remarkably, he even had business cards of his own, Felix Sater, the Trump Organization. So here you've got a guy who is identified with Russian organized crime. He seems to be tied in with the most powerful, perhaps the most powerful gangster in the world, and the number one target of the FBI, as we know. And there he is hanging out with the Donald. So obviously this is a very, very interesting relationship, and it's a relationship that we'd like to know more about. Now, the problem is we can't know much more about it because the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office has worked for years, the Justice Department have worked for years to try to suppress the details of this thing from coming out.
I know it's a little complicated to explain, but give it a try, Jonathan. Why, in fact, the revelation of so much of this, particularly with regard to the relationship between Sater and Trump, puts the whole Trump financial empire at risk? Well,
because the question is, did Donald Trump know that Felix Sater was a criminal and had this criminal history? If he did, and he was in business with him in all of these various ventures, as Russ mentioned, then he is liable for millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from the other investors, from people who bought condominiums, who were co-investors in the hotel, like Trump Soho. And in terms of Trump Soho, that was really a Felix Sater operation from the beginning. He kind of thought it up. He got partners from Iceland, a bank called FL, which seems to have relations with Putin. And so he started bringing in Russian mob money to finance this so-called Trump Soho Hotel. So it was really more of a Sater Soho than it was a Trump Soho Hotel.
And Russ, a lot of this money potentially was coming in at a time when Trump was in financial trouble as a result of some of his other operations.
Well, that's a key point, that as his fortunes went south with the problems with his decisions against the advice of all kinds of people, taking huge risks with all of those casinos in Atlantic City, and as all kinds of other things went south, he had more and more problems, and it is in this period that we see not just Felix Sater and the connections to the potential connections to the Mogilevich outfit and to Putin, but we see all these other figures and entities tied into Ukraine, Russia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and so forth, all of these oligarchs, again, tied back to the approval of the Putin regime, and they're basically propping Donald Trump up. And so the issue becomes, when they're looking at, the FBI is looking at the issue of whether Russia meddled in the election, there's a much larger issue, which is, why did they like Donald Trump? What did they expect Donald Trump could or would do for them? And to answer that question, you've got to go back and look at this whole history of these people and these entities playing a critical role in his financial fortunes and their own relationships back to Putin.
Why then, now that so much of this is exposed, why does this present a problem for the FBI now? in terms of its own priorities and where its investigation is going? Russ?
We know that the FBI has strived mightily to keep this from coming out. There were some lawyers involved with a suit on behalf of someone who worked for the Sater's company who've been trying to get to the bottom of some of this, and they have been slammed down very, very hard. Extraordinary measures where they've essentially been told, they say, that they should not tell any of this to Congress. So if the FBI is so concerned that none of this come out for some reason, one wonders how they can do that on the one hand, and on the other hand, be able to fairly and thoroughly investigate everything that we need to know about Donald Trump and Russia.
And why was the FBI, in your view, and both of you can respond to this, Russ, start with you, why was the FBI so concerned about this not coming out?
Well, we don't know in full why. We can speculate. I mean, one of the likely issues here is simply the kind of posterior covering that goes on. The FBI was working with a man who was guilty of extensive crimes, and they advocated for him to be let off with a slap on the wrist, if that. And they did that because they were using him. Now, this is very, very similar to what happened in the notorious case of the mob leader Whitey Bulger up in Boston. This was a huge problem for the FBI. One of its biggest embarrassments, really, in its history, was that it was basically protecting this criminal while he was continuing to commit crimes, including murders, ostensibly because he was so high value. Now, what Felix Sater was doing, if anything, and we don't know. He may have gone straight and done nothing wrong, but for some reason they're very, very concerned that relationship not be revealed. And, of course, it would be very interesting to find out what that is about.
Well, Jeff, let me add that this could be embarrassing for the FBI in other ways. One of the FBI agents who is basically handling Felix Sater is now working for President Trump in his security operation, his private security operation. And two of the prosecutors who helped work out the original deal and then spoke later on behalf of Sater in court proceedings are now working for the law firm that is supposed to be sorting out President Trump's conflicts of interest. So there are kind of cross currents here that could be embarrassing, I think, to the FBI and to Donald Trump.
How close did this investigation bring them to being able to do anything with respect to Mogilevich? Russ?
Well, see, that's the rub. We don't really know if it was successful or if it was a colossal failure. And obviously, if it was a colossal failure, that's not the kind of thing that they want to come out either. Especially, why make this sort of a deal if you're not going to succeed? The indications are that they didn't really succeed. We know that Mogilevich was on the FBI's most wanted list, and we know that several years ago they removed him very mysteriously. We don't know why they removed him. There's nothing, as far as we know, reports one sees that world-girdling criminal empire is very much still operating all over the place, now in many, many different facets and industries. So what that was about, did they succeed? We don't know.
And what do we know about the connection between Mogilevich and Putin?
You can't operate in Russia without getting along with Putin. I think he put him in jail once, very briefly, to show that he was sort of in control, but then let him off soon thereafter. And the assumption is that they worked pretty closely together. Yeah,
that's right, what John said. And also, in Russia, there is no clear line between the official establishment and, let's say, the unofficial establishment. And most experts believe that the government and the so-called legitimate oligarchs and the underworld are intertwined in so many different ways that you can't even sort it out. Experts also say that Putin and Mogilevich are close, and I think the most important thing of all is that a man named Ivankov, who was Mogilevich's lieutenant, who came to the United States to run operations for him, and who, by the way, the FBI wanted to find him. The first place they found him was living in Trump Tower, and then they couldn't track him down, and then they next found him over at Trump's Taj Mahal. I think is very significant. That man later returned to the Soviet Union, and he stated on one occasion that Putin and Mogilevich were very close. Shortly thereafter, he was assassinated by a sniper while walking on the street in Moscow.
What is the status of Felix Sater today, Russ?
We don't know the exact status of Felix Sater, but he is certainly alive and well, and this is another fascinating development. As you may know, in January, there was a meeting held at a hotel in New York City, and at that meeting were Michael Cohen, Trump's personal attorney, and Felix Sater, and they met with a Ukrainian member of parliament who is pro-Moscow. What we are told from news accounts is that at that meeting, the Ukrainian presented a proposed peace plan for Ukraine, which seemingly had been approved by or perhaps sponsored by Putin himself. And there he is meeting with Felix Sater and Trump's lawyer. And then, according to this parliamentarian, they then agreed, and Cohen took that proposal in an envelope and brought it to then National Security Advisor General Michael Flynn. There's been some backpedaling on that story, but it seems to be true, and that's very, very interesting that this mob person tied into Putin is so still active that he's able to sit down with Trump's personal lawyer and work something like this.
By the way, when he surfaced at that meeting, he seemed to have gone back to his original spelling, which is Sater, but the entire time he was being handled by the FBI, he was he gave his name as Satter, which is one reason why people could not trace his criminal past, and why many of his business associates had no idea that he was a felon, a convicted felon.
Russ, I want to come back to this idea of why the FBI is so compromised as a result of this, particularly with respect to any further ongoing investigation with regards to Trump and the Russia connection.
I think it's because in order to tell the public or Congress or some combination everything that they know about Trump's relationship with Russia and the back history and the origins, they would have to tell this story that we're telling here, but the whole story and all the other details. And I think they simply can't do it. It's problematical on a whole host of fronts, and it's probably a deep embarrassment as well.
And even if it weren't an embarrassment, they just don't like to tell details of operations they've run because it gives insight into how they work an operation like this, and they'd be very reluctant to reveal an operation this extensive.
What do you expect the reaction to this story to be, Russ?
You know, it's hard to tell. I mean, of course, there have been so many revelations, large and small, coming at us seemingly by the hour that one really can't tell. But we would hope that this very thorough look at the larger picture behind this sort of more specific focus about hacking and so forth, the effort to get at the bottom of the whole matter to try to understand why Donald Trump seems to be so close with Vladimir Putin, what, if anything, Vladimir Putin or the Russians may have on him, that this would be seen as compelling enough and persuasive enough that the failure of the FBI, which we think would be a failure of the FBI, to get to the bottom of this, could be circumvented through the appointment of an independent prosecutor or some sort of independent body to look into this whole matter.
It does seem that there are really three specific buckets and areas of investigation in all of this, and that's what makes part of it so complicated. There's the financial side, the criminal side, and the political side.
Right, Jeff. I think the what this would, if this were really opened up, we'd find out just how much of Trump's operation was financed not just through Russia, but through Russian banks, but through Russian mobsters and money laundering, and that could be quite revealing, and that's quite different than the rest of this investigation that Comey is conducting.
And finally, Russ, talk a little bit about the work that you and Jonathan and your associates have done in putting this story together. Give us a little background and how all of this came together over a period of several months.
Well, this was a team effort. The third member of the team, C. Collins, did a tremendous amount of research on this, poring over a large number of legal documents and extremely complicated technicalities in attempting to figure out what this all means. And then John and I came in to provide additional context, to do additional research, and the three of us worked together very closely on this. And now we've brought in more of our team, including a lot of editors and fact checkers and a lawyer and so forth. And it's really a terrific team effort, and it has to be with something of this enormity.
Russ Baker, Jonathan Larson. The story appears at WhoWhatWhy.org. I thank you both for sharing some of this and encourage folks to read the whole story. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jeff.
Hi, this is Russ Baker. If you like that podcast, please feel free to share it and help others find it by rating it and reviewing it on iTunes. Also, if you'd like to see us continue to do this kind of hard-hitting investigative journalism, we need your help. Please support our work. Go to WhoWhatWhy.org/donate.